Hi. So my name is Amanda, and I run a small business called Uniquely Mateo. And for me, I go crazy with all things jelly roll rugs. That's kind of accidentally turned into a really big passion of mine. So I know for jelly roll rugs, for those that don't know what that is, you take strips of fabric and combine it with batting to make a really beautiful rug. And what's wonderful is these rugs are washable. So if you have kiddos like I do, they're definitely machine washable. For example, I have one in my car, and 2 times now I've spilt an entire soda and I've blotted it up with the rug to where that worked out. A lot of people have a love-hate relationship with jelly roll rugs for those that are already familiar with them. But if you're not, I can give you the most common, and the pattern that you are going to be getting in the giveaway is the oval. And let me show you what that looks like real quick. And what is so wonderful about these is because they're made from strips of fabric, you can get as creative as you want with these layouts. Now, the most common is the oval, and most people are familiar with that, which is also why we're doing the oval pattern for the giveaway. But there are so many other things that are wonderful about jelly roll rugs that people might not quite realize. So on Sewing Parts Online, you will have, and in this giveaway, there is the standard jelly roll rug pattern that most people are familiar with, but there's also the colossal rug, which is your circle. And what I'll also be showing you is the rectangle, and the one I'm missing is actually the jelly roll rug tree skirt. So there's a lot of versatility with these rugs that people don't quite realize are available, which are amazing. Now, all these patterns are available on Sewing Parts Online, but let me kind of give you some examples of that. So I showed you the bigger oval, and what's wonderful is you can get creative. Now, the patterns will tell you the strip count and the start to get different sizes, more of your standard sizes. Now, if you get a little addicted like I do, you kind of get a little crazy with this. But let me show you a smaller oval, for example. So this one is another oval that I like to use. Now, this one is the size that I like to use for like a pet bowl mat because they are washable. You know, your dogs are going to get crazy and messy, but this is another size you can do. The pattern will also have the placemat for the oval. So a lot of times you can kind of think outside the box and get really fun with it. Now, the biggest I have done when it comes to the circle is I've gone crazy and I have a 6-foot diameter circle. But since that one would be a little hard to hold up and show you guys here, here's another example of the smaller rug that you can do. And other shapes that some people don't quite think of is going to be your rectangle. And the rectangle to me is the only jelly roll rug that you have 100% control of what you want your rug to look like. Because whenever you're assembling this rug, unlike the other ones, you are going to have this in individual strips laid out. So what's great about that is you can mix and match and get as crazy as you want before you commit to assembling it. When you have your oval, your circle, or your tree skirt, you can get a pretty good idea. You can get a really awesome educated guess. But the only layout you'll know 100% it's exactly what you want is going to give you that rectangle, which is a really good benefit of that shape. Finally, the other shape that I did mention is the tree skirt. Here we go. You got your, I'll come in funny for you guys, your jelly roll rug tree skirt. So all of them are a blast and have their advantages. And one thing I did also forget to mention, all these patterns are by RJ Designs. And the one thing that they did come out with their rectangle is there is a jelly roll rug too. Now, what's great about this pattern is if you flip it over, not only are you going to get that rectangle that I showed you, but you're also going to get some really cool half rugs. Now, the half rug is featured in the rectangle jelly roll rug pattern. What I did recently, though, is I made a circle as a watermelon rug, and I thought that was so fun. And I was inspired by the rectangle pattern to chop that up in half as well to give me a watermelon slice half rug. And you can see here, this one is done with the circle instead of the rectangle. But if you're wanting that pattern if you're definitely a pattern person, you're going to find that on the rectangle rug. With any project, the biggest thing is having the items that you need to get this rug done. So I definitely want to go through all the different supplies that you need to make this happen. And I also want to go through why you need them, because fortunately, this is a very beginner friendly rug. You don't have to go out and get an extensive amount of materials to make it happen. So whenever, first and foremost, you're going to need a sewing machine. Fortunately, you're not going to need this crazy, fancy, expensive machine. As long as your machine can do a good straight stitch, and if it can do a zigzag stitch, it needs at least a width of 5. So if you can do a width of 5 and a width of 5 zigzag and a straight stitch, you're good to go. I will say, when I first started doing these rugs, the machine that I use, I would do a zigzag of 7. I really liked it nice and big, and I'll show you why later. But now I even bring it down to 5.5. I like that tighter zigzag. So if your machine can only do a 5, don't stress, you're still gonna make it happen. The other thing that I would say in regards to your machine is you will need, and I say need lightly, and I'll explain why. You're going to need a flat surface to make these rugs. A lot of times, what people run into is the biggest issue and frustration with making these projects or these rugs is you're going to make a really beautiful bowl, or you're going to get waves in your rug. And during this segment, I'm going to go through lots of tips to help avoid that. But one of the biggest things is having an extension table or having a flat surface for while you're assembling that rug. You're going to help encourage and train that fabric on where you want it to go. As I mentioned before, one thing that I do is I teach sewing classes specifically for these rugs in a private Facebook group. And during the drawing and the raffle, one of you awesome, lovely people are going to be joining my class. And what I run into a lot whenever some people have these waves, specifically in the waves, more so than the bowls, is one of the things is they underestimate the value of a flat surface. Now, one thing I will say, if you do not have an extension table, if you're new to sewing and you have just your machine itself, that is okay. We can get nice and crafty. What I would do and what I usually recommend for people to do is you could even just get a whole bunch of books and stack them up with the plate on your machine. And that can get you a nice flat surface without having to spend a lot of extra money. And I figured I could also take you guys on kind of my little journey of extension tables, because initially I would get crafty, put a whole bunch of books and make it happen. And as I started to fall more and more in love with these, I kind of started upgrading and kept shifting the way I would make my rugs. So after I decided I'm going to do this way more often, I don't want to keep piling up books to make this happen, I went ahead and I bought an extension table. Let me move you all down real quick. And originally, when my journey began, I had the Juki HCL F300. And one thing you might want to look into is a lot of machines have the accessories where you can purchase an extension table specifically for your machine. So even whenever I first started out, I went ahead and just got the extension table that came with my machine itself. And I made a whole bunch of rugs on this just fine. And as my little journey continued, I kind of fell more and more in love with it. And I kept thinking, well, I still want a bigger extension table, because the longer you have that surface flat, the better odds you have of teaching and kind of whipping your rug into shape. Let me pick you up real quick. So let me show you. After I purchased the extension table with my machine, I went ahead and got the Sew Steady. And if you're not familiar with Sew Steadies, what's beautiful about these is, let's say you have an older machine, or if you have a machine that the manufacturer didn't make an extension table for, they make custom cuts to any machine you have. So after that, I went ahead and got a little crazy because I loved it. And this is my Sew Steady that I had. Oh, and this, by the way, where we go? My daughter drew me, so this is me on my Sew Steady. But that is kind of where I went next. And lastly, the other option that you do have, and I know Arrow's been on these lives as well. Let me kind of angle you guys down. I got really nice and wonderful. And I finally upgraded my entire table to one massive extension table. So again, if you already have an awesome big extension table, more power to you. But if you don't, that's okay. You don't have to run out and spend a lot of money to make this happen. There's a lot of varieties of, let me give you all a little tilt there. There's a lot of varieties of extension tables that start with $0 all the way to where you can get much higher. So it really depends on your personal comfort and your budget. But now that we know, hey, our sewing machine can make it happen, and we have a flat surface regardless of how we get there. The next thing you're going to need is your fabric. Now, the whole name of Jelly Roll rugs stemmed from the beautiful Jelly Roll. So Jelly Rolls are strips of fabric that are all 2.5 inches wide. Now, if you are new to Jelly Rolls, one thing I would be mindful of is your standard roll is 40 strips, but they also sell half strips or half Jelly Rolls. So if you're making your rug, I would reference your pattern because it does say your strip count for whatever size you want. But in general, typically, your roll is either going to have 20 strips or 40 strips. So that's one thing I would be mindful of whenever you're going out and shopping and getting ready to start your first project. Because whenever I took initially this as a class with my local quilt shop, I didn't know that. And the class was about to start, and I ended up buying a half Jelly Roll. And I was super excited. And luckily, my cousin caught it. I was missing half of the project that I was going to need. So I'd be mindful of that if you purchase the pre-cut. The other thing that is really wonderfully beginner friendly about Jelly Roll rugs is you could have initially zero prep. So a lot of people do like to, let me get you up real quick. A lot of people like to cut their own fabric, cut their own batting. And if you don't like to do that, like I am not a fan of cutting that, you can get everything pre-cut. So it makes it nice and easy. You don't have to stress. I know whenever I first started sewing, nothing gave me more anxiety than cutting fabric because I hated wasting money. I hated the idea of if I mess this up, that's it. I didn't even have enough money for this in the first place. And I would kind of take myself mentally down not a very productive path. So before you stress about it, you can get it pre-cut. So after you figure out whatever fabric you want, whether you cut it yourself or whether you get it pre-cut, the next thing you're going to be needing is definitely your batting. Now, whenever you go to Sewing Parts Online, you're going to notice one thing. You can get your batting on a roll. Whoop, got you upside down there. Batting on a roll. And there are two different size options. Now, when you're looking, they're both going to be 50 yards, but one is going to be 2.5, and the other one's going to be 2 1/4. Now, technically, both will get the job done. So for whatever reason, if you already have one of these in your shop or in your sewing space, don't stress about getting the opposite size. Both will work. The biggest thing that I would say is whenever I first started, let me grab this real quick to show you. Whenever I first started making these rugs, I actually preferred the 2 1/4. And the reason why I did is because that gave me that extra 1/4 of an inch for whenever I'm combining my fabric with my batting to kind of have some wiggle room. And if, for example, and let me back this up real quick, because what you would be doing is you're going to take your wonderful strip of batting and you're going to combine that with your strip of fabric. And what you would do is you would fold it similar to a bias tape. So whenever you're making your wonderful folds, you're putting them on top of each other and you fold, having it at 2 1/4 is going to give you a little extra room to not have to be so precise. If you have it at 2 1/2, and you like, for example, this one is, that's going to give you the exact width for each one. So whenever you fold over, it might be a little more complicated for you to kind of make your binding. So for example, back when I took that sewing class, I showed up with a 2 1/2 sorry, a 2 1/4, excuse me. I had the more narrow batting. My cousin happened to show up with the 2 1/2. Well, I noticed I was getting through my tubing and kind of prepping my rug much quicker than she was. And we couldn't figure out what was going on. And what ended up happening is she was having a more difficult time folding her batting and her fabric because she didn't have that wiggle room. So initially, I preferred the 2 1/4, and I sewed with that for the longest time. But as I got more comfortable, I thought, you know what, I want to try the 2 1/2 because it would likely make my rug thicker. So for giggles, I tried the 2 1/2, and I actually prefer it now. So I wouldn't even overstress. If they're out of stock in one versus the other, both will 100% get the job done. The last thing I would hate is for you to get excited about a product, go to a website, and then realize, oh no, what if I buy the wrong one? After you've gotten your wonderful fabric and you've gotten your batting, the next thing you're going to be needing is your sewing needle. Now, the different patterns will tell you you can use a denim/jeans needle, a top stitch, or a micro text. Now, when I took the sewing class, the instructor gave everybody denim needles, and that is what I used for the longest time. And one of the big reasons why she emphasized the denim needle is because whenever you are assembling these rugs, you're going through a lot of layers of fabric. You're going through 4 layers of fabric plus your batting. So you want a nice strong needle to make it happen. The one thing I would be mindful of is your machine might prefer a different needle than the other. For example, when I initially started, I used the denim needle for all my rugs, but I noticed for some reason my machine started skipping stitches. And I went through the entire list. Okay, I cleaned my machine, I got a new needle. I was running out of ideas and I got really, really mad and I was almost ready to just throw my machine out. Well, fortunately, after going Google crazy, someone had recommended a top stitch needle. And they swear that that ended all of their issues with their machine. And I thought, there's no way after I went through all of this, just buying a different needle can fix it. And sure enough, for my machine, that did the job. So out of what they list on the patterns, what I personally prefer is the top stitch needle. But if you already have any of the other needle types that are listed in the pattern, definitely feel free to try them as well. It just depends. Your machine might like the denim more. So, but nevertheless, I would absolutely make sure you get the right needle and make sure you get a new one because there's going to be a whole lot of stitching going on this rug. Now, the other thing about these rugs, because whenever you assemble them, you're doing a zigzag stitch, it eats up a lot of thread. So you're going to want to make sure to have a lot of thread. So the pattern initially will recommend anywhere from 1,200 to 2,000 yards of thread. So I would prepare yourself and get ready for that. Now, what I personally like to do is I like to match my thread color to my fabric, just because that helps really conceal, for example, that helps really conceal and blend and make it nice. Whoop, there we go. Where it kind of helps conceal that stitching. But if you don't have, if you're new to sewing and you only have, maybe a couple of colors, that's okay. Even when I first started, I would use the same color for a lot of my rugs for quite a while before I ever switched it over. But whether you use the same color thread or whether you switch up the thread colors, just be prepared to go through a lot of it. After your thread, the next thing you want to make sure you have is a good iron. If you happen to have a variety, I always like a small iron and a big iron. And as we get closer, let me move you over here real quick. For the irons, I like a small iron and a big iron because as I am assembling my rug on the machine, I like to iron in closely as I go. So it's nice to have the little one because in the beginning, no matter the shape you're going to do, you're going to want to use your iron a lot, especially as you kick out of the gates. Now, when you are done, I prefer to go ahead and grab my bigger iron just to make sure I really give it a nice press when I am done. But if you only have a smaller iron or a bigger, I wouldn't stress either. You just want to make sure you have an iron either way. Now, for me, I ended up upgrading to the Aliso just because my wonderful husband had a horrible habit of leaving it face down. And if you've never, and we have quite a few ironing boards that have a nice burnt spot. So what's wonderful about this particular iron is it has an auto lift. So you can comfortably always leave it face down without worrying about burning anything in the process. But any iron can do. You don't have to do this one. I just call this one Nick Proof, which is my husband's name, which works out really good. But you just definitely will want a hot iron to get the job done. So those are all the things that you will absolutely need at minimum to make this rug happen. Now, the next couple of items are things that are very beneficial and helpful, but not absolutely required. So if you are making these, what I would really recommend, if you have one, is a walking foot. Because we are going through and having a lot of layers, having a walking foot is really, really, really going to help you work that fabric through. And if you are new to sewing and you don't know what a walking foot is, I didn't either. So a walking foot, when you're sewing, normally there's teeth on the bottom of your machine to help pull that fabric through. What a walking foot does is also put teeth on the top. So you're hugging that fabric from both sides and moving it through. That's another thing that's going to make it much easier to work and maneuver these rugs. Don't be like me. Whenever I first started, for some reason, I thought a walking foot was like a crutch. Like, oh, if you need help, here's your little baby walking foot, which is kind of silly because I was a beginner. So even if that's what it was, that would have been helpful. But for whatever reason in the beginning, I thought, I don't need it. I don't need a baby crutch. And that's just really naive talking. I wasn't aware of its purpose and why it's beneficial. So it is, I've heard in quite a few videos throughout the spring social and the event, a lot of people mentioning a walking foot. So if you don't have one, you don't need it for this project, but it is a really good versatile tool to make it happen. But after your walking foot, one thing you may or may not want, and I'll show you why later, is wonder clips. If you do not have an extension table, what a lot of people like to do is as they are assembling and making their wonderful strip of fabric and strip of batting into a tube, they like to go in advance and do their fold and clip and kind of do quite a few feet before they get to their machine and sew, just so that prep work is ready. And I promise I'm going to go through this whole list, and then I'm also going to show you on the machine, just so you can kind of see what I'm referencing. But I personally don't do this because I like to use my extension table. But if you don't happen to have one, Wonder Clips are a wonderful tool to get that going. The only thing I don't have to show you, and if you look on Sewing Parts online, there is a binding tool that you can also use to help prep and get this into position. I will say for me personally, I wasn't as big of a fan of it. I ended up giving mine to my aunt, but my aunt loves hers. And I have quite a few people that have taken my class that really enjoy it. Especially, I know I had one person that has a lot of arthritis in her hands. And for her, having that tool was really beneficial. So that is something that may or may not be worth looking into. But which also reminds me, one thing why I love these rugs and what makes them so beginner friendly, it is the same step on repeat. So for the most part, there's 4 main steps. You would take your individual strips into one long strip. You would make your wonderful tubing, and then you would pretty much from there assemble your rug. And that is why I like them. It's more beginner friendly. I can sit for hours and just sew and not stress. There's not a lot of stop and go. There's not a lot of stopping and cutting and measuring. So for me, it is very nice and easy, not very stressful. But for your hands, doing this step on repeat, if that does get tiring for you, that tool may or may not be beneficial to help. The other thing that I would say, if your machine happens to have it, a knee lift is amazing. And if you don't know what a knee lift is, your machine may or may not have it. but it attaches to your machine. And instead of manually picking up your foot with whatever lever or button, this allows you to do it with your knee. And the reason why that is helpful is because in the beginning of all these rugs, you tend to have to maneuver quite a bit in the beginning. So having that knee lift frees your hands to kind of position your material. And again, I'll show you on my machine in just a minute how that is. So for those final items, you don't have to have it, but if you already have it, or if you really start to fall in love with this, I would definitely recommend looking into them, because with any job, having the right tools will always make it that much simpler for you. Because sewing's fun, right? We don't want this to be nice and hectic. But those are all the items that you would need to rock out any of these rugs. Now, I know this segment is called Rolling with the Punches. And as I mentioned before, people usually have a love-hate relationship with these rugs. So the two most common things you're going to run into are going to be bowls and waves. And what I want to do is take a minute and kind of go through the most common things that people run into and how we can avoid that. So the first and foremost, outside of the rectangle rug, the oval and the tree skirt and the circle, you can lay out your fabric and get a fairly good gauge of how you think you want your fabric to look. How do you want your rug to look? Now, it's 100% preference, but for me, I generally like to start off lighter in the middle and work my way out to darker. And the reason why I like to do this, one, I feel like visually it looks better, but that also puts your darkest color around the end of your rug. So one, that helps frame your rug, but then two, that side's gonna have a lot of the dirt. It's gonna have a lot of the most love hitting on it. So having the darker on the ends will help kind of conceal that. But even if you kind of get the best gauge, what I always recommend is after you've gotten all of your individual strips into one long strip, the pattern will tell you to go ahead and fan fold your strips just to make it more manageable and get it back to a bundle for you to keep sewing. I personally like to roll my jelly roll all the way back into a ball. Now that is a little more time consuming, but let me show you why. So for example, as I showed you earlier, you do have, this is your standard jelly roll. And I can look and think, okay, I have a pretty good idea of what I want. Now, I will say if I use a pre-cut jelly roll, 95% of the time, I'm going to keep it in the order that this came in. But after you've put them all together, rolling it back up into one strip, what that will do is give you a nice preview of what your rug is going to look like. So for example, this is the exact same roll. So this is what it looks like when it comes in the package. And once I rolled it back up, this is now what it looks like. So what that does is kind of show me, oh, okay, this is, give or take, what my rug is going to look like. And there's been a couple of times that after I've taken it from all of its wonderful individual strips to this, I realize, oh, you know what? I would rather switch this with this, or whatever the case is. Rolling it back up, I call this a cinnamon roll. So I take my individual strips of my jelly roll and I make it into one big cinnamon roll. But your cinnamon roll, what that does is really help kind of give you the peace of mind and confirm, yes, this is what I want. Because as I mentioned in the beginning, the only one you have complete and total utter control over is that rectangle. You can mix and match all you want. For the oval, the tree skirt, and the circle, the moment you make that tubing, you've committed. I mean, nothing's impossible, but it would be a lot of work to go back and try to rearrange that fabric. So taking it from its jelly roll to that cinnamon roll will help give you that preview, just to make sure, hey, I love it, we're ready to rock and roll. The next thing that will help your rug be as beautiful as possible is when you are folding your fabric. So when you are making your folds, one thing you want to do And as I mentioned before, we would fold it like a binding strip. You would have your two outer sides meet in the middle. And after they have met in the middle, then you would fold over again. I would be very mindful when you are making these folds to make these two little butterfly sides. You want them to be as even as possible. If you are not paying attention, I've seen a lot of people, including myself, you can have it where they're uneven. That is going to make it significantly harder for you when you are assembling your rug. You want to make sure your two outer sides are meeting in the middle and you're folding over nice and even. Having this part as even as possible while you are assembling is going to set you up for success whenever you're making your rug down the road. So that is the one thing I would be mindful of while you are folding your fabric over. And with anything, what you're going to hear me say a lot is the more consistent you are, the better. So from this point on, once you start folding, the more consistent your wonderful fold is. And let me back it up to show you. This part is already put together. You want to have it as even as possible because that's going to really, really help. You're going to thank yourself down the road. I keep turning because I have a wonderful checklist for you guys. I don't want to miss anything. The other thing too, whenever you're making your fold and how you're going to help yourself later is we are going to be sealing this with a stitch. When you do your fold and they meet in the middle, let me get a little closer for you, you have better odds of catching all those layers. If you are not careful with your fold, let me back up for where it has this. When I open my little butterfly, you want to make sure everybody's nice and tucked in. So if you are not careful and you open this butterfly, there are times where I did not catch all of my fabric. So I would make sure when you do your first fold, you have your outsides meet in the middle. You want them to touch, and then you want the outside to be as even as possible. That's going to help make a smoother rug for you when you're looking at it. In regards to that, the next thing, similar to your batting, this next option, there's going to be two different ways you can do it. Neither is wrong. It's just going to be whatever your preference is. After you've gotten your wonderful fold, you want to decide where are you going to put that stitch. Now, there's two different options you have. You can, let me get that over for you. You can stitch right in the middle, which is what I do. And the reason why I stitch in the middle is because this tubing fits right in the center of my walking foot. So I used to stitch on the side, but I wasn't as consistent with my stitch. So I enjoyed putting it right in the middle so I can have a nice consistent stitch as I go. Now, doing your stitch in the middle is going to do a couple of things. One, it's going to give your rug a more textured look. You're definitely going to see that extra lining. And the other thing it's going to do is it's really going to show that thread. So one of the reasons why I really like to match my thread color with my fabric is because I stitch in the middle. And when I do that, let me grab one of these for you. Let's go with the small one so I can show you easier. Because I stitch in the middle, it really shows. And you can see how this rug has a real textured look. That is what I prefer. The other option, which is also amazing and a lot of people do, is instead of in the middle, you can stitch right here on the side. And there's a couple of advantages to that. If you stitch closer to that side, you're going to be more likely to catch all of these folds. So that's where I've noticed a lot of people in my class that are beginner prefer to sew closer to the end just because they want to make sure they catch all those layers. Now, if you decide to do your stitch on the side, it is going to give your rug a fluffier look, a good fluffy, and it's also going to really help conceal that stitch. So let me pull back out my small one for you. So for here, if I was to put my stitch on the side, you're more likely to have that zigzag stitch go over it. So it's going to help conceal that stitch for you. So neither is wrong. The only thing I would do is before you start that step, figure out which one you want to do and try your best to commit to it. Because as I said before, the more consistent you are, the better your rug's going to come out. Now, if you're a beginner or if you notice, I kind of do both, like I'm kind of not doing a very good job at being straight, that's also okay. Just keep in mind, one, the more you sew, the better you're going to get. And also, the more you're able to keep it consistent, the better. But it's not a deal breaker, and we all have to start somewhere, right? Now, on to the big one, right? One thing that people have a lot of issues with is they either get a bowl or they get a wave. For the most part, this is going to be for your oval, your circle, or your tree skirt. Whenever you are assembling them, in the beginning, and I have my handy dandy little rainbow here for you. In the beginning, anytime you come across these bends, that's going to be a much tighter curve than it is as you get out. That's why in the beginning of these rugs, it's a little harder, but as you go out, it gets easier and easier, in my opinion. But because we have these tight bends, whether it's the circle or the oval, you're going to need to feed in extra fabric. You're going to need to help put a little extra fabric in there to make that turn. And if you don't know what feeding the fabric is, hopefully I'll have some time, I'll hop on the machine to show you. But as a whole, if you are feeding the fabric or giving it some extra fabric to get that turn, if you notice you start getting a wave in your rug, that means you're putting in too much extra fabric when you are assembling this rug. If you are starting to make a beautiful bowl, that means you're being too tight on that incoming tubing when you're making your rug. Now, most people have the opposite. It's one or the other. When they start the middle and they make a bowl, they're going to have an easier time when they spread out. Or if you're on the flip side and you're having a pretty good time, you think, oh, Amanda's crazy. I'm doing fine. But the farther you get out, you realize you're starting to get a wave. It's because you're still putting too much extra fabric into that. Is the most common, biggest struggle that most people run into. But folding your binding or your kind of little bias, making it nice and even is helpful. Having that consistent stitch, and then also finding that balance of feeding the fabric is all tools that will help you with success in making your rug. The last biggest issue that I would say people run into is they don't catch all those layers. And luckily, I have my mistake to show you. I noticed before this, let me get my little guy back out. And if you don't catch all of your layers, where'd he go? Here he is. This is what you'll run into. The top of my rug looks great. Nothing's wrong with it. But whenever I turn, you will see on the flip side, I didn't catch all of those layers. And now I have this little bubble. Now, when you run into that problem, what you can do is you can go ahead and I would rip out this zigzag right here and you can go back and redo it. But that is one of the other reasons why you want your tubing to be as even as possible. That's going to help set you up for success when it comes to assembling this. You will be less likely to miss that extra stitch line. Now, the other two things I will say before I hop on my machine is, one, if you notice you're starting to have issues, if you're starting to get a bowl, if you're starting to get a wave, don't keep going and hope it's going to get better. Normally, it won't. You're going to need to address the issue as it comes. So, for example, with the oval, which is the most common, if you come right out of the gates and you make your first center lining, let me show you what that is. So this middle is where you start. If you notice that that is not straight and it looks kind of like a banana, so the banana means you're already pulling too tight. I would backtrack and start over. And again, with my class, think of it as an addition or an aid to the pattern. My class does not give you the pattern. So what's wonderful about the giveaway that they're doing, you're going to have the pattern. You're good to go. But if you are a visual person, like I am, I struggle with that paper pattern. Or if you're getting frustrated and need some help, one perk of my class is I can be there to kind of help you personally troubleshoot your individual rug. The last big troubleshooting tip I have that is new to me um, is with the tree skirt. So the Jelly Roll Rug tree skirt, for me, when I was working on it, I really struggled making this circle pretty. And I tried everything. I would put like a big 2-liter soda and I would try to make it beautiful and try to troubleshoot. And the pattern does go over how to start it, but I was struggling with still not making it a beautiful circle. So the one tip I would want to give you guys that I recently, for me, works, believe it or not, it started with a CD, like an old school. See, I mean, hopefully you guys have them still. CD to put that as your starting center. But if you don't, what I've also done is I've cut out on paper plates whatever size I want. Because again, they're very versatile. I made a little tiny tree skirt during the holidays for my miniature Christmas tree, all the way up to a 6-foot diameter tree skirt for my parents. So you're going to want different size circles depending on what you're making. But what I've come to realize is if I take either a CD or I cut out on a paper plate the size I want, what I do is I stuff this in between where my little butterfly fold is, and I usually wonder clips to go around. That is what's really helped me get a nice beginning circle to my tree skirt. And again, that's not in the pattern. That's just a little tip from me to you. That's what I started doing. I would get my little paper plate. I put a whole bunch of little wonder clips all the way around. And that helps me kick off and kickstart the rest of the pattern just because my circles were always so wonky. Let me go ahead. I will try to be quick because luckily I can show you a couple of things on the machine with the time that we have left. Brian, if you wouldn't mind, it's going to take me just a second to get this switched over, and then I can give you guys another look of what I'm talking about. Okay, now that we are back on the machine, one thing I will show you is this step is down the road, and this is after I am assembling my tubing with my rug. Now, this is where a lot of people can get stressed. So whether you are doing your circle, which you would have your tight bend here, or your oval, this is what I was talking about in regards to feeding your fabric. So let's get down to the corner. So once we get to the bend here, if you start to get a bowl, it's because you are pulling too tight on this string. You are, or the tube, excuse me. You're not giving it enough cushion. So as I was showing y'all on the rainbow, these first bends are quite tight. It's going to need that extra fabric to make it all the way around without making that bowl. So here, as you can see, I'll go a little slower. I'm giving it a little extra fabric, which is also called feeding the fabric, into this as it assembles. And in the beginning, I will say that's where having that knee lift, here you can see both of my hands are here, and I am able to maneuver this as I need. Now, you don't have to have the knee lift, but it's definitely helpful, especially in those beginnings. So I'm giving that extra tubing as I go around. Now, once you make it around the bend, let me get it going. Whether it is your first initial run or farther down, once it is straight, you no longer have to push in that extra fabric. That is when you're going to start getting your wave. You want to just keep these simply side by side. Since there's no arch here, there's no need to give that extra fabric. So whenever I'm going through, what I like to do is simply place this tubing where it's supposed to be. So I'll just go straight down, and I'll go a little faster on this run. I like to go ahead and just get it in place. And if I need to, stop and reposition and keep going. Now, one thing you will notice, especially in the beginning, it is okay to have a little bit of a bowl. Let me show you. So here you can see, as the unofficial jelly roll expert, I still have a little bit of a bowl here. What we want to do in the beginning is after every bend, we are going to stop and iron that. Whenever I took the class, everybody would physically remove their rug, go to the ironing table, and come back. For me, what I like to do whenever I've had an extension table, you can't do this when you have books. And technically, Arrow might get mad at me. I don't know if they will or not, but I honestly just iron it right here because this is so thick and I have the table. I'll just take my little iron and I'll just go right on top of it before I keep sewing. Now, my aunt screams at me because she's convinced I'm going to ruin the table. But fortunately, I haven't had any issues. But if you have maybe a solid wood or something, I would be mindful of whatever material you have on your table. But for me, I just go right on there and then I just keep on going. It's very helpful. The biggest thing is to stop, address it, and keep moving. If you notice your wave or your bowl and you don't stop and fix it early on, then you're going to be in a whole lot of trouble. But let me also show you in regards to catching all those layers. When I am assembling, I don't even pay attention to this top part. What I do is pay attention to my bottom because if you run into an issue where you're not catching all your layers, 9.5 times out of 10, it's going to be this bottom one that you miss. So as I am sewing and I am assembling, I am looking for that lower layer. That top layer is going to fall into place. That's also going to help prevent you from having any issues whenever it comes to assembling your rug. So that I would say is the couple of things to be mindful of. That is typically the biggest headaches that everybody runs into. Now, let me cut this real quick. In regards to your tubing, let me backstep a couple of, I have my little baby rug that I can show you guys steps on. But let me go to where I am making that tubing. Let me get it into place. So from here, as I mentioned before, I like to put my stitching right in the middle just because that lines up with my foot. But, and as I mentioned before too, I like to use my table to help do my fold and get things into place. If you do not have a good extension table, or if you're not comfortable doing that, that is where I found a lot of people in my class prefer to make that tubing, do some wonder clips for a while to get it prepped, and then start sewing. So neither is wrong. It's just going to be whatever you are most comfortable with. But again, no matter what, if you sew smack dab in the middle or on the side, you're going to want to make sure that these two folds meet in the middle, and then you have a nice even fold here on the side. That is what's really going to set you up for success when it comes time to assemble your rug. I know we're getting close on time, and I definitely want to leave a moment for questions. So if you guys hop back on, I can switch my camera back over, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, if any, before my time runs out, if that works for you guys. Placemats is going to be with your oval. So you're going to want, well, I guess you could do circle, but typically most people, if you get the oval pattern will tell you how many strips and what your starting length is to make a placemat. So absolutely, you can do that. So it depends. The one thing I would say for me personally, I actually use serger thread because I go and fly through so much thread. I actually use the cheaper thread. I don't get too crazy. For me, I started off with the, I think, Cloaks and Clark's cone thread at Walmart. And then I switched over to the Maxi Lock just because they have a large variety of different colors. So for me, I care about the color choices a lot. Oh man, I'm not that talented. As far as I'm actually really looking forward to a lot of y'all's thread segments because that is something I'm not very versed in. Currently, my wonderful sewing journey has been masked for COVID and these wonderful rugs. So the logic behind the weight of the thread, I don't know. I typically just go with your standard serger thread for me. Oh my gosh, I love it. Love it. So I recently had my good old faithful iron that, oh, I can't show you. It's on the other side. That are, my little one's broke. So it was a little like $12 iron. and it lasted years. So I finally thought that was my opportunity to upgrade. I mean, close to, at least 100 rugs on it, and my Aero table has been awesome. Like, shout out to Aero just so that they know. The reason why I got that table, one was for the extension table, but second is I had the wrong heights for my sewing machine. I was just using regular tables whenever I was sewing, and they were too high. So I was constantly in this position, and I would have significant shoulder pains. So that table saved me immensely. I don't have any more shoulder pains because I can adjust that height as I need it. Absolutely. So my sewing classes are all virtual, self-paced. So I have 2 classes a month. And each month I will always have the oval class because that is the most sought after and the most beginner friendly. But then I will also have a separate specialty class. So, for example, for the month of April, I have an oval class and then I have the tree skirt class. And what that is you are able to, at the first of the month, access that at your own leisure, just because everybody typically has nice, hectic lives. You know, you have to work around kids, their schedules are work. So it's there when you're there. And outside of that, if you run into issues, I have a wonderful, crazy life, but I am also always accessible. So if you're at your machine and you're just losing your mind, I am there ready to help you out one on one with whatever you're running into. Oh my God, the camaraderie in those groups are awesome. I've had people from Europe and UK and Canada, and seeing everybody come together and so and watching everybody else's pictures has been amazing. Yeah, absolutely. So I am on TikTok at uniquely Mateo. I am also on Facebook and Instagram. Now, all the classes I do are going to be in a private Facebook group. But so you will unfortunately have to have Facebook if you're wanting to do the class. But outside of that, you can find me on those 3 platforms.